The movie begins by showing a flashback scene. There are two children who are running in the house as if avoiding something. Not long after, one of the children named Alex was hidden in the closet, and a moment later the other child named Daniel was surprised by the arrival of a man wearing a wedding dress. But the man looks in a badly injured condition. The man asked Daniel not to make a sound because he said someone wanted to kill him, but it seems that Daniel did not care about the man's request, and he immediately shouted that the man was with him. Not long after that, there were several people who appeared and attacked the man. Then he was dragged into a room that read Lomas. And after that, there were screams from inside the room. Short story 30 years later, the children named Alex and Daniel are now adults. Scene Alex, who will hold a wedding ceremony with his girlfriend named Grace in his family's luxury house. A moment later, Daniel, who was already married, entered and invited Grace to chat. Daniel reminds her that she should not marry Alex and suggests that she should just leave the family. But Grace takes the words as a joke.
Congratulations, you fuckface.
Before the wedding took place, it was seen several times that Alex was also still convincing Grace whether she was sure to be his wife, because Alex said that this family was not like a normal family in general. But again, Grace just thought it was all a joke, and she still wanted to marry Alex. The Lomas family, which is already famous for its wealth, seems to dislike Grace and thinks she only wants their family treasure. Seen from the gaze of Alex's Aunt Helen, she looked at Grace with a cynical look, but Daniel explained by saying that his family just wanted to make sure that Grace was a cheater or not. Long story short, the wedding went smoothly, and after the event, that night Alex and Grace rested in their room and intended to have sex on the first night. But suddenly, Helen entered and noticed the two of them from the front door. She said that all family members were waiting for them in the main room. Of course, Grace was very angry with the attitude of Alex's aunt, who disturbed their first night. Grace asked Alex for an explanation. What did it mean that all the members were waiting in the main room? Alex explained that their family did have a ritual game in welcoming new people. Because Grace was new to the Lomas family, so she had to play the game to get official recognition and be accepted as a member of the Lomas family. Hearing this, Grace became very optimistic and excited because she really wanted to be close and accepted as a member of this family.
Yes, you must be the bride.
Hi.
Fitch Bradley.
Grace.
All the family members were seen gathered in the main room. They were all talking and telling their family customs, which was to play a game that had been passed down from generation to generation in the family. His mother Alex approached her and said that actually she thought this was just a silly game, but because it was a tradition, so there was nothing wrong with being respected and done. Not long after, a waiter in the house named Stephen reminded them that the time was 11:55 p.m., which meant the game had to start at 12 p.m. They all then sat at the round table and listened to the father give his speech. He explained the history of his great-grandfather, who was a very poor merchant, but suddenly his great-grandfather became rich, until it was passed down from generation to generation until now. While talking, he took out a wooden box that would be used to start this game, the box that had been there since generations from his great-grandfather. It turned out to be obtained from a billionaire named Mr. Lovell. Since then, the family's life has changed drastically. But there is a condition. They must comply with the game that the box will determine to each new member who will join the Lomas family. Seeing the father put a blank card in the box and gave it to Grace. Then he invited Grace to pull the card and see what was written on the card. Grace innocently pulled the card from the box, and she laughed when she saw what it said, because she got a paper with hide and seek written on it. But when the family found out that the game was hide and seek, suddenly everyone was silent and surprised. Especially Alex, who looked shocked when he saw the card. Long story short, it was 12 o'clock at night, and they had to play the game immediately. Grace was invited to hide anywhere, as long as it was still in the house. Grace protested a little, because according to her, in the big house there were many CCTVs that could see her anywhere. And finally, all the CCTVs in the house were turned off, and access to leave the house was also all locked. Grace thinks that this is just for fun. And finally, she tries to find a hiding place. But on the other hand, the entire Lomas family is not like wanting to play hide and seek, but like they want to do a hunt. They arm themselves with various weapons. Meanwhile, Alex, who is seen whispering Grace to meet him in the room, he immediately ran and tried to find his wife.
Am I really supposed to know how to use this thing?
Then the scene moved. A servant was seen sleeping in the nursery of the Lomas family. Then there was a child named George, who escaped from his bedroom. On the other hand, Alex finally found Grace. He tried to convince Grace not to take this game as an ordinary game, and he promised to get Grace out of the house. While they were talking, suddenly the servant who was looking for George entered their room, but when the servant wanted to leave the room, suddenly her head was shot by Emily, who is Alex's younger sister. She thought that it was Grace, but it turned out to be their servant. Seeing that, Grace finally realized that something was wrong with this hide and seek game. Not long after, other family members came, and they thought Grace had been shot, but it was not. They casually dragged the dead servant out of the room. When the situation was deemed safe, Alex also took Grace to another hiding place. They were seen arguing. Grace demanded Alex to tell her what really happened. Alex, who looked very depressed, could only say that Grace had pulled a wrong card. And now Grace had to become a sacrifice for the Lomas family. Because it turns out that the Lomas family has a deal with the devil, which makes the family wealthy until now.
You have to play.
So just listen to me. You just need to go straight.
While Grace was hiding, Alex also returned to his room and acted as if he was also looking for Grace. When Grace was looking for a way out, she suddenly met Daniel, Aunt Helen, and Alex's father, who were carrying the corpse of the waiter. Those who saw Grace immediately wanted to shoot her. But on the other hand, it turned out that there was Emily who immediately shot. Fortunately, Grace had time to dodge and duck, so Emily's shot missed, and instead almost hit her own father. Grace then went into the billiard room to hide, but suddenly Daniel accidentally entered the room and saw her. Grace begged Daniel not to kill her. Daniel said that the habits of rich people tend to be strange compared to other people. Daniel, who might remember and regret his past actions, he also gave Grace 10 seconds to escape from there.
She's in the study!
Now she knows what's going on.
We must kill the bride by dawn.
Then, not long after, the father finally decided to activate the CCTV camera so that he could easily and quickly find Grace. But on the other hand, it turned out that Alex was already in the surveillance room to find out Grace's whereabouts. Meanwhile, Grace, who was looking for a way out, entered the main room and took a gun hanging on the wall of the room. Then she went to the kitchen, but when she was in the kitchen, suddenly there was Stephen, who entered the kitchen to make coffee. Grace, who was hiding, finally ventured and threatened Stephen to open the locked kitchen door, but Stephen did not seem afraid and said that the gun Grace was carrying was just a display in the main room. Grace did not believe it, and she tried to shoot the gun, but it was true that the gun was just a display. When Stephen wanted to attack him, Grace took a teapot filled with hot water, and she hit Stephen's head until he fainted. Then he immediately ran away from there. Alex, who was in the monitor room, immediately destroyed all the equipment there. His father came in and saw it, and he immediately attacked Alex. Then Daniel came to separate the two of them. But as soon as his father hit the back of Alex's head until he fainted, then they took Alex to his room and handcuffed him. When the family gathered again, they were seen arguing. Father and Aunt Helen began to panic because Grace had to be caught immediately to be their sacrifice before sunrise. If they didn't do it, the entire Lomas family would be jinxed, and they were the ones who would be the victims. Unknowingly, it turned out that Grace was eavesdropping on their conversation, and she accidentally fell. Meanwhile, Emily's husband, who was browsing the internet, did not realize that Grace had fallen behind him because he was busy looking for information, whether the agreement with the devil was really real or just a hoax, because he thought that in this increasingly modern era, the family members were just like following tradition, and he considered this game just a silly thing. Grace, who was in the courtyard, was seen running and entering the Lomas family farm. There she met George, the boy who had disappeared in the room and was wanted by her servant. Grace thought that George was just an ordinary child and could be cooperated with, but it turned out that George was still part of the Lomas family. He already had a gun in his hand and immediately fired at Grace. The shot also hit her hand, and Grace immediately hit George until he fainted. At the same time, suddenly there was a goat that surprised her, so she fell into a hole, which turned out to be a dumping ground for the bodies that had been victims of the Lomas family. Grace was trying hard to get out of that place. Not long after, Daniel's wife, who was outside the house, she saw Grace running in the front yard, and she immediately prepared to shoot, but the shot missed. Arriving Grace at a fence, she forced her way out until she tried to damage the iron fence, so she could get out of there. Not long after, from a distance, she saw a car that wanted to pass. Grace, feeling that she had a chance to be able to ask for help and escape from there. Grace, who was already frustrated, finally desperately passed through the gap in the fence, which was actually so narrow that her skin was torn. When she managed to get out with severe injuries, it turned out that the car that was expected to help did not want to help her, and the car immediately left there. Quickly, Grace immediately rushed into the forest. Meanwhile, Stephen was seen patrolling for Grace using a car. Seeing a torn white dress on the fence where Grace came out earlier, he immediately guessed that Grace must have run towards the forest.
Grace.
And not long after, Grace was found and chased by car. Stephen finally caught Grace. Then a fight broke out between them, until finally Grace managed to strangle Stephen with her dress until he was helpless. Grace, who felt that Stephen was dead, rushed into the car and intended to take the car away. In the car, Grace tried to dial an emergency call, which was available on the car's features. But because this car is a sophisticated car, so there is a kind of code to access the emergency call, and if you answer incorrectly, the car will be considered stolen and automatically stop. Even the door is immediately locked from the inside until the police arrive. As it turned out, Stephen wasn't dead yet, so he went over and smashed the windshield, then shot Grace in the right arm with a stun gun, which knocked her out. On the way home, Stephen reported that Grace had been arrested and was on her way. But apparently on the way, Grace, who woke up, immediately attacked Stephen, which resulted in the car having an accident and made Stephen die on the spot. While Grace managed to survive and get out of the car, unbeknownst to her there was Daniel, who pointed his gun. Again, Grace begged Daniel not to kill her, but this time Daniel was not kind and immediately hit Grace until she passed out, because it turned out that his father was also there. In short, Grace was finally captured, and the ritual was about to be carried out. Meanwhile, Alex, who was handcuffed in his room, managed to release the handcuffs. And in the main room, all family members began the ritual by reciting offering spells, while taking turns drinking water from a special cup. But after all family members have drunk the water, suddenly everyone is poisoned and vomiting. It turns out that Daniel has given a temporary poison in the drink in order to free Grace. When Daniel managed to take Grace out, suddenly Daniel's wife caught them and blocked them. Daniel tried to persuade his wife, but the wife, who was afraid of losing all the treasures she already had, she shot her own husband instead. Grace, who saw this, was immediately angry and attacked Daniel's wife. After that, Grace met her father-in-law, who really wanted to kill Grace. Grace immediately hit his father Alex, using a lantern lamp until he fainted. And she also threw the lantern lamp on the floor, which caused a fire. On the other hand, her mother-in-law came and tried to shoot Grace, but fortunately the shot missed, and there was a fight between them. Feeling helpless, Grace looked around, and she got a game box that fell to the floor to be used to hit her mother-in-law many times to death. Alex, who saw his mother had been killed by his own wife, he looked very depressed. When he wanted to approach Grace, he apologized while hugging her, but it turned out that Alex was just pretending, and he immediately smothered Grace and shouted to call his family members. Quickly, the rest of the surviving family gathered, and they rushed to perform rituals before sunrise. They began to cast spells while holding Grace, while Alex was appointed as the executor to kill his wife. As Alex prepared to stab his wife, Grace gripped Aunt Helen's hand hard, which made the knife miss Grace's shoulder. Grace, who struggled, managed to get out of the family's trap. Aunt Helen was very surprised to see that the sunlight had begun to enter the room, and when she opened the window, it turned out that the sun had risen. The whole family began to fear, as if they were going to be burned by the sun, because their mission to subjugate Grace after failing, but in fact nothing happened. They even looked very silly, because they wanted to follow the requirements of the ritual.
I fucking knew it. It's all bullshit.
Grace?
But Aunt Helen, who was very angry, still insisted that Grace must die, even though the deadline had passed, because maybe Aunt Helen could not accept defeat. When Aunt Helen was about to smash her axe, her body suddenly exploded, causing her blood and flesh to scatter all over the room. This also made the entire Lomas family shocked. But in contrast to Grace, who seemed to laugh contentedly when she saw one of the family members explode, until finally only Alex was left alive, he begged Grace to be forgiven and save himself. But Grace was fed up with Alex's words. She threw their wedding ring and asked for a divorce. Immediately, Alex's body also exploded, and his blood soaked Grace. The fire that had been sparked by the lantern light became large and burned the whole house. Grace walked over and picked up her mother-in-law's cigarette, and she sat down to lament her fate of suddenly becoming a widow in just one night. As usual, the police in the movie finally arrived when all the events were over, and they immediately secured the house. And the movie was over. The lesson we can take from this movie is that getting rich by shortcuts will not last forever. Thank you for watching, and see you soon.